Right, hello everybody, and welcome to the first post-it note video for Honors Environmental Seminar. Um, just a couple of reminders to get us started with, and then we'll kind of go through an overview of the book, and then we'll kind of get into it. So first, remember that we're going to have a quiz after each section. So after you watch this video, go to On Campus and look for the quiz for the first section, right? They'll be labeled. Just a couple of questions. Remember also, for those quizzes, it's not just what's on the little post-it notes. Post-it notes are what I think is the most important and what we'll be talking about in class. There's a lot of really good information in there, and so the quiz will be on the entire reading. So make sure you're doing the entirety of the reading. Okay, so to give you a little overview of the book, we have our book here, Environmental Science for the AP course, 3rd edition. As you open it up, you've got a couple of really helpful tools in here. So the first thing that's really helpful is going to be the brief contents. So if there's anything that you need to look up, this will give you just a unit by unit section that will show you what is discussed in that unit. For the most part, we'll be covering this course unit by unit, and so it'll be pretty easy for you to follow along in the book for the most part. We'll take a couple of deviations for things like public and private land. We'll take a couple of deviations for biodiversity and evolution. We'll take a little bit of extra time as well for pollution, and a little bit of time for GMOs as well, which will be fun. But for the most part, we're following this course guide. As we get further in, as you can see further into the contents here, let me zoom in a little bit for you. As you can see here, each unit is going to have, it's broken up into chapters and modules. So we'll be following the modules, and each video will have, each module will have a corresponding post-it note video. You'll be assigned 2 or 3 of these at a time at the very most. Some weeks it'll only be 1. Really depends on how much you're trying to get through and how challenging the material is. As you can see, the introduction, we start with what environmental science is. And then we have a little chapter 1 review, right? So real easy, we'll fly through that no problem. Followed by environmental systems, right? And then that's going to be a little bit where we get into some new stuff that you haven't seen before. So little things like that. As you flip through, we'll get closer to the start of the first chapter. All right, here it is, the first chapter. Each chapter will have a description of what modules are in it, so you can kind of get a feel for what we'll be studying each chapter, which will be really exciting. And then each chapter also starts with a case study. This one in particular is on fracking. While it's very interesting, you will not be quizzed or assessed on this at all. We will have a lot of time to talk about fracking later in the year, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So while I recommend you read it, it's not required reading. It's only 1 page or 2 pages, and then it kind of goes on. So for Module 1, Environmental Science. So we're going to start the lecture now. So pull out your notebook or pull out your post-it notes. We're going to get started. Environmental science. What is environmental science? Well, it's a great question, but first we kind of have to define our terms. What's environment? So environment is going to be the sum of all conditions surrounding us that influence life. Well, that's kind of a little bit of a broad topic. So what are the conditions that influence life? I'll give you a second to think about it. So if you thought sunlight, you're right. If you thought the temperature in the surrounding area, you're right. Precipitation, access to water, all those things. Those are all good things. But also the other life around it, right? So how would we do in the middle of summer if we didn't have trees to hang out under in the shade, right? Or how would certain reptiles do if there weren't any warm rocks to lay on, right? So there's So a lot of things in the environment around us that that help us thrive and help other animals thrive. And so the environment is going to be the sum of all of those conditions. So then what is environmental science? Well, it's the field of study that investigates interactions among human systems and those that are found in nature. So it is a science, though, so we are using the scientific method, which we'll get into in Module 3, as you saw earlier. And then the ecosystem is broken up into a couple of different, the environment is broken up into a couple of different segments or sectors, and we'll be thinking about this throughout the entirety of the course. So the first segment is called an ecosystem, which is a particular location on Earth with interacting biotic and abiotic components or factors. Well, that's kind of a couple of words there that might be a little unfamiliar to you. So first of all, what does it mean to be biotic? Well, biotic is anything that's living, right? So something that has DNA or something approximating DNA, something that self-replicates, right? Anything that's living. So remember in biology when you talked about defining life and how that might be, a little bit of a problem. It's not too easy to do that, but for the most part, what we're talking about here is something that is living. Now, abiotic just means, if for all of my Latin phonetics out there, a meaning not, biotic meaning living, so not living. So anything that's non-living. So this is a really challenging concept to understand sometimes. Non-living does not mean dead. It means dead, but it means more than that. It's also things that have never been alive. For example, this desk here, this is made of wood, right? This wood is dead. However, it wasn't always dead, right? At one point it was alive, but it's not alive anymore. So it's dead. So this is abiotic. A stone, on the other hand, never was alive. There are no processes of life that formed it. And it's used by some forms of life in some instances to live, but rocks are also abiotic, but they have never lived. Water is another good example of something that's abiotic. We use water all the time. There are a lot of living things that live in the water. We would die without water, but it is not living. It does not self-replicate. It does not have DNA. It doesn't fulfill the specifications for life. So we're thinking a lot about environmental science. We're thinking about the environment in general. But we want to differentiate this from environmentalism. So environmentalism is a social movement that seeks to protect the environment through lobbying, activism, and education. That's great, but it's not environmental science, right? A lot of environmentalists use environmental science in their attempt to preserve the environment, but environmental science is not environmentalism. If you have any questions about that, make sure you write them down and bring them to class. All right, I found this diagram here to be really helpful. I recommend you take a little look at it. It's showing how the environmental science kind of impacts environmental studies in general, but it also includes how environmental social sciences and humanities can impact environmental studies as well. And so throughout this course, we'll be not just talking about the sciences, we'll also be investigating literature, law, ethics, a little philosophy and economics as well, to kind of get a more rounded picture of environmental studies in general. But always kind of coming back and rooted in the environmental science. So what are environmental studies? Well, environmental studies is the field of studies that includes environmental science and other subjects such as public policy, economics, philosophy, and literature, kind of what I just mentioned. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is humans altering natural systems. Now, we'll talk about this more in class, but something that I want you to think about in preparation is, what do we mean by natural? What does it mean to be natural, right? I don't know how well you can see that. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit for you. Yeah, so what do we mean by natural? So read this section, think a lot about what natural means, and we'll talk about that more in class this week. So like I mentioned just a moment ago, humans alter natural systems. Well, just like we were defining our terms earlier, we're going to define our terms again. So what do we mean by humans? Well, hopefully that's fairly obvious. By humans, we mean anything that belongs to the genus and species Homo sapiens, right? So that's you, that's me. That might not be the guy that's sitting next to you in class, but most of us are human, for sure. And what do we mean by system? Well, a system is any set of interacting components that influence one another by exchanging material, energy, or information. Right? So, thinking about systems and natural systems, what is a natural system? Well, a natural system is anything in nature, right? Natural, nature. Anything in nature that influences one another by exchanging material, energy, or information. So, think about high fives, right? Which we're sadly not really supposed to be doing anymore, but high fives, right? That's transferring energy, right? That's what's making that clapping sound. High fives. That's transferring of energy. And so that's a system. You've created a system. And because ostensibly you aren't within some sort of super nature or extra nature, it's a natural system because it's something that's occurring in nature. Now, when we're talking about humans altering natural systems, what we're really discussing here is environmental impact. What is the impact that we have on these systems? And is that for the good or for the worse, right? So we're thinking about me driving my car to work every day. Is that going to help the environment? Is it going to harm the environment? How is it altering the environment? And is the cost outweighing the risk to the environment? That's going to be a big theme that we'll talk about throughout. Now, one other thing I want to mention here is that the boundaries of environmental systems are defined by the frame of reference of the observer, right? So we get to pick how large the system is, what the system is that we're studying. And the more effort we put into this, the easier it is to define our terms, and the easier it is for us to make meaningful environmental studies, especially in the sciences. This is a really great diagram to go over here. I highly recommend you take a couple of minutes to look at it. It's going to explain that point really, really well. And that is it. That is our first Post-it note video. I hope that wasn't too painful for you. Remember, any questions, bring them to class. We'll spend some time at the beginning of class thinking about them. And then we'll kind of get into it. Make sure you go to On Campus right now after you read and you answer the quiz questions that are there. There will only be a few. What that does is it helps me gauge whether or not you're reading, and it gives you some easy points if you paid attention. So thank you for paying attention, and I'll see you in class.